Hello, good afternoon. Today, our guest is Professor Anthony Gill, and Professor Gill is a professor of political science at the University of Washington. So, how are you doing, Professor Gill?
Doing very well. Thank you for having me on your show.
I'm doing great too. So, in 2022, you published a paper titled The Dynamic Efficiency of Gifting. But before we discuss this paper, Professor Gill, I'm going to ask one question. Do you like getting gifts?
I love getting gifts and I also love giving gifts. That's the neat thing. I know there's a lot of people that feel embarrassed about getting gifts, but one of the important things that comes through all my research is that you have to be a graceful recipient in order to be a good giver as well. So it's a lot about reciprocity. And I love giving gifts, I love getting gifts, and all those different rituals we have throughout the year, be it Christmas or be it birthday parties or whatever other kind of celebration. Gifting is actually really fun and it's also really good for the economy.
But some economists argue that gifts impose a deadweight loss on the economy. Are they correct?
Oh my gosh, yes, this is how this research all started. There was an article back in 1993 by Joel Waldfogel. It was somewhat of a tongue-in-cheek article in the American Economic Review by saying that giving gifts create this thing called deadweight loss. And that means it's just kind of a sink on the economy. It's wasted resources. And it's kind of easy to understand when you think about your own personal experience. Have you ever received a gift that you didn't want? Right? Maybe your aunt gave you an ugly cat sweater. You're like, oh, I don't like sweaters. I don't even like cats. But your aunt gives this to you, and maybe the sweater costs $50, and you would have rather had the $50 than this cat sweater, and yet the cat sweater sits in your closet, and I mean you have to wear it once a year when your aunt comes over to visit, and it's just horrible. And Professor Waldfogel said we should maybe kind of measure this, because when you give a gift to somebody, it's not that they've asked for that thing. So when I go to the store, I know what I want to buy. I want to buy a can of tomato soup, and the store gives me the tomato soup. But in a gifting relationship, you're really not sending any signal about what you want necessarily. You could, but somebody gives you something and then you receive it. And so he went out and measured this dead weight loss. He asked a number of undergraduate students, uh, how many of you have received a gift, and what would you value it at? And then they looked at the price of the good and they kind of compared it. And a lot of people received gifts that were worth less than what the actual price were. It wasn't valuable to them. And again, this was the dead weight loss, the thing that's coming up. And so, Professor Waldfogel concluded that gift giving is not very efficient for the economy. In fact, he scaled this up, and he did a few other experiments on this, and kind of did a really fun book called Scroogenomics, by the way. And I recommend it because Professor Waldfogel is an excellent writer. It's a really fun book to read. He added this all up. He says, this costs just around Christmas time. It costs upwards of $1 billion or more dollars of just goods and services that people get that they don't want. Oh, and that's really bad for the economy. And when I read that article, I said, oh, this is a great way to teach economics to students, teach them about deadweight loss and gains from trade and exchange. And so for the past 30 years or so, I've been teaching that, and students love talking about this stuff. But it was just a few years ago, a good friend and colleague of mine, Michael Thomas, and I said, "Oh, we should get together and write something." I said, "We should write something about this gifting and basically respond to Professor Waldfogel," and that is what we did.
So I'm going to share my position. I'm a graceful recipient, but I don't particularly like to get presents. I will give presents out of duty because there's an expectation that one will require a present. So I will distribute them out of duty. I prefer to give money, but I think that the economy of presents is quite inefficient. It could have a utility value. It's sentimental and it makes people feel good. It's embedded in the market economy of sentiment. That's my own view.
I mean, that's very possible. First of all, there is the sentiment behind it. And I often ask my students, so, what's the real value of the gift? And when I tell them it's inefficient, they shriek in horror. They go, oh, that's horrible. It's not the gift that matters. It's the giving and that. And they're in many ways right? It's the thought behind the gift that really counts. Although there are times when gifts are very thoughtless. They're not very thought through very well. And so, like, well, yeah, they didn't think through it, but it was a kind gesture, and I value that kind gesture. I think part of that is true, right? It is the thought that counts. But there's a lot more to this. And you said something that was really interesting to me. You said it's kind of my duty to give, right? And my duty to receive, that you're a gracious recipient. Do you like giving? Let me ask you this. Do you like giving gifts to people?
I am dutiful. I'm Kantian. Yes,
Mhm.
I am Kantian. It's the golden rule. It makes society easier when we follow some social protocols. But I am not emotionally invested in giving gifts to people.
Yeah, so that's a really important thing, right? You mentioned that there's this kind of social aspect to it, and that's going to be an important part of our response to Professor Waldfogel, why gifting is actually really important. Again, I run across a lot of people who say, "Oh, I really don't like getting gifts. I feel horrible about it." A lot of people do give gifts, as you do, out of duty, right? There are certain times of the year, at a Christmas or Hanukkah, or it might be, for a birthday party or a graduation ceremony. There's a lot of different gifting rituals around different celebrations. So people sometimes do it out of duty, but sometimes you give gifts and you make people smile, and that kind of feels good. And one of the things I'll kind of pat myself on the back here. One of the things I like to do is carry a lot of smiley buttons with me, and when I travel. And so when I check in, if somebody's really nice at the hotel counter, or a flight attendant or something, I hand them a smiley button. It's a very simple gift, right? Maybe 50 cents of all the metal and stuff like that. Very simple gift, but it really brightens their day, right? So I love doing that, and oftentimes surprising people with that. And they often are very grateful for that. And I tell people who, well, I like to give gifts, but I don't like to receive them. I say, it's a two-way street. You have to be a good gift recipient in order to allow the person to be a good gift giver. So being a recipient, a very graceful and gracious recipient, means that you're actually giving the gift to another person of allowing them to gift to you. And that's, when you start to think about that, you say, oh, okay, it kind of, winds around a little bit and helps us build stronger social relationships. And that's really what Professor Thomas and I are getting at in this article that we wrote.
Presence enhance the efficiency of human corporations, and that makes markets function more effectively. So your example is quite pointed. You went to the hotel and you gave somebody a present, she felt good. If she feels good, she's going to treat you good, and she will treat other people good, and the hotel will make more money. So
Yeah.
presents make
And
the
it's not
economy
just
more
about money,
efficient.
though, right? It's about the relationships. So
Yeah.
you made a very good point here, right? When I give the smiley button to the hotel clerk, they're very happy with me. And sometimes, they just dealt with a difficult customer and they're a little bit down, or they're having a rough day for some other reason. They get the smiley button. It raises their spirits, right, a bit more. And I might get a little special treatment or something like that, which is always kind of nice. But also, I mean, they feel better about the next person that comes by. Right. So I lift their spirits a little bit more. And, they say, oh, yeah, they treat the next person really nice, which increases the value of the hotel experience. Right. When we think about, renting a room at a hotel, it's not just merely, okay, I give you a bunch of money and you give me four walls and a bed and that kind of thing. It's the entire experience, just interacting with the staff and the ambiance of the hotel. But those human relationships are really important part of the experience too. And we notice when they're bad, but we also notice when they're really good. And so anything that anybody can do to improve that quality of experience is going to be very valuable for the economy. And it's hard to measure in dollars, right? This is one of the things that, and there's a lot of experiments done to see what is the exact dead weight loss of gifting and stuff. A lot of it that doesn't capture is this little stuff. Like I hand the smiley button to the flight attendant who's having a bad day, and they're like, oh, this is really great. They start smiling. And then the people behind me in the rows that are getting their food, they get treated better. And that, it's hard to measure that, but it's really important for economies.
The benefits of presents could outweigh their deficits. As I said earlier, presents are like a form of positive externality.
Exactly, and they're a very specific one too. So our article is called "The Dynamic Efficiency of Gifting." So what I talked about, Professor Waldfogel, he was kind of measuring the static efficiency. Is this $50 sweater that you received from your aunt, is that worth $50 to you? And if it was only worth $20, well, that's $30 of dead weight loss statically, just right then and there. But really what we are arguing is that gifting, as being oftentimes sacrificial, being ritualistic, and being public, and involving a reciprocal relationship, is really good for an economy. And to understand this, it's important to go back to one of the grandfathers or the founders of modern economics. That's Adam Smith. Adam Smith said that the wealth of nations is a function of the division of labor. So the more we specialize, the better we get at things, conditioned on the extent of the market. So it's a simple thing, right? It's a 900-page book or something like that. It's a real simple formula. The wealth of nations is a function of the division of labor, conditioned on the extent of the market. You can have more specialization if you involve more and more people in trade. And that's great. Now, the question becomes, what happens when you start to extend the market? When you start to extend a market, you start trading and interacting with people that you might not know very well. They might even be complete strangers. So Professor Thomas and I talk about this in terms of quasi-anonymous or anonymous trade. And when you go to buy something at a store or to interact, to get somebody to do clean your gutters or some kind of service, and you don't interact with them very much, you're kind of wondering, well, they say they're going to do a really good job cleaning my gutters. How do I know that? Can I trust that person? Trust is a very, very important thing. It's one of the big transaction costs that economies face. It's really the uncertainty about the motivations and the intentions of other people. And we would like to basically overcome that uncertainty by building trust in society, or generalized trust. Is that, from anybody I kind of interact with, I can pretty much assume that, yeah, they're a good person. And if a mistake occurs in an interaction or something, they sell me a product that might be defective, they'll go ahead and say, oh yeah, you know what, I'm going to make it right for you. So the question is, how do we build that generalized trust? Because without that generalized trust, markets will tend to shrink. And with markets shrinking, then you can't take advantage of the division of labor and the economy is poor. Our argument is that gifting is one of the most universalistic methods of building generalized trust. And the reason is because gifting is actually a sacrificial act. You're not asking anything of me. I'm going to come to you and I'm going to say, here's this beautiful sweater that I think you would love. I dipped into my own bank account, pulled out $50, and I gave you this sweater because I like you. You didn't ask for it or anything. And that's a sacrifice. That's me almost like, if you didn't like the sweater, it's me just like burning $50 in front of you and saying, I really like you and I'm going to, show you this because I'm sacrificing for you. And sacrifices are really important things of building trust. In fact, if you go back, you see this too in, religion. You go back to the Old Testament, the sacrifice of Isaac, Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. God came along and said, hey, Abraham, do you really trust me and believe in me? And are we good? With one another. And Abraham says, yeah, I'm really good with you. And God said, yeah, prove it. I want you to make a sacrifice. I want you to kill Isaac. And he's like, whoa. And he's about to go through it. Spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read the Old Testament, Isaac isn't killed. But it was a test, right, to see if you're willing to sacrifice. And what gifting is is a sacrificial act. And again, the way this helps an economy is saying, okay, I'm going to show you that I can be trusted, and if anything ever goes wrong, I can, you can be certain that I'll make it right by showing you up front that I'm sacrificing relationships. In Japan, one of the gifting traditions is that whenever there's a business transaction, the two parties exchange, little goods. They're kind of silly. They're not, really valuable per se. They're little knickknacks or trinkets or something like this. Sometimes they're a little bit more involved and ornate, but it's a way of saying, hey, I can sacrifice. And so if anything ever happens and it goes wrong in our business transaction and our commercial transaction, I'll be there to make it right. And that's really important. And so that's a key component part of the gifting of the gifting economy, the ability to sacrifice and to signal that, hey, I'm a trustworthy person. I can be counted on sacrificing resources in the future. If anything goes wrong, I will make things right. Those are the kind of people you want to do business with.
Trust. That's the real grease in capitalism. Well, Anthony, you wouldn't understand because you live in the United States of America, a rich country. I don't know if at any point in your life you lived in a poor country with really low levels of trust. Have you?
Not in low. To what extent? That's an interesting question. I don't know. Overall, what countries have had low levels of trust, but there are countries I've lived. I've lived in Chile for a while, Argentina, Mexico, and one of the things that I noticed, and I think this is really important too, is that even in these very poor countries, people are very willing to, especially when they first meet you, to sacrifice. So when I first moved to Chile, I stayed with a family in a kind of lower middle class area. And when I came in, they had this big banquet for me. And this is common throughout the world too. You go, oh, welcome to, the stranger coming into our house. We're gonna have this big banquet. And we're gonna basically provide more food than is really efficient. And that's a way of saying, okay, we're going to be together for, a couple months. I'm living there for several months. And they say, in order to do that, we want to show that we're willing to, be generous to you. And that's really good because another part of it we'll talk about in a second is reciprocation, that I will also be a very good guest in their house as well, too. And you see this, and one of the things that interested us in this study, and we went back to a anthropologist called Marcel Mauss.
Yes.
And he wrote a book called The Gift about 100 years ago or so, early 20th century. And it's rather revealing. He said, first, gifting is ubiquitous, right? It's one of these universal cultural traits that every society throughout time and place has done, right? Some do it more, some do it less. Okay, that's always an interesting thing. But he says even in very poor societies, they will oftentimes have these elaborate banquets, these potlatches. He talked about this kula tradition in Indonesia, Micronesia, where different tribes would paddle over to different islands and they would have these big ornate ceremonies, all before they started commercial interactions. And again, a lot of it was like wasted resources. You say, why would a poor society waste these people in a poor society waste resources? Because they want to build trust. Now, I think the interesting question you bring up is that there are different levels of generalized trust in different societies. I think a lot of that goes to, the effectiveness of the overall government. And in various places that are very underdeveloped, Afghanistan or Oman or Yemen or someplace like that, levels of trust might be very low because the government isn't very effective. And so people kind of, start to worry about that. Not surprisingly, the economy tends to shrink.
It does.
Right. And that's not good. So what you see in a lot of these societies is local communities, at their own level, trying to rebuild this despite the government. And a lot of it involves this kind of gifting ritual. So they're doing it kind of at a lower level. How does that scale up in these societies? That's a study somebody else needs to do, and maybe something I will look at in the future.
I am thinking about this topic on many levels. So, for example, transaction costs, trust lowers transaction costs. So business is more efficient in high trust economy, and it's also easier to achieve simple goals. Poor countries are also highly regulated countries. They lack economic freedom. Why do they lack economic freedom? Because there's a paucity of trust. So people on the left like to tout the successes of Scandinavia, but Scandinavian countries are individualistic and they invested in pro-market policies before achieving success as a welfare state. And even today, Denmark and Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and Iceland especially, they don't perform poorly on measures of economic freedom. So, and that's because
Mhm.
of trust. They are high trust societies.
Yeah, and there's been some interesting research related to this. There's a group of, it's an interdisciplinary group led by Joseph Heinrich at
Yes.
Harvard, but I
Weird.
think Sam, Herbert Gintis, and a few others have kind of studied this. They do these little game theory exercises with different people all around the world, and a lot of it's playing an ultimatum game or a collective action game and things like this. They're kind of seeing if people have pro-social tendencies, if they're more generous toward one another. The most interesting feature that they found was that individualistic societies tend to have individuals who have more pro-social or generous behavior. And I do this in my political economy class too every year. And we play a little experiment, and I show them, oh, you're pretty generous, and maybe more than you think you are, and your neighbors are more generous. And I ask them, do you think people are more generous in more kind of communitarian societies, or more individualist market-oriented societies? So communitarian societies, the way they define it, tends to be much more closed, not connected to broad markets. And most people say, well, it's obviously the communitarian, societies are a lot more, generous and the like. It turns out the opposite. It turns out individualistic societies are, because again, going back to what we were talking about a minute ago with Adam Smith, is that when you expand a market, you free markets kind of move out very broadly, you're going to start interacting with strangers. Well, if you're going to do that, you have to find some social norms, some rituals, a certain set of values that it's going to allow you to trust other individuals. And so they oftentimes have, these individualistic societies build up a lot of social trust because they have to. Because if you're trading with people you don't know very well, you have to be able to trust them. And again, I think gifting is really important to this. The Heinrich stuff is absolutely fascinating in terms of that. And there was another study by Benjamin Enke,
Yes, I
also.
read that study, Benjamin, on kinship.
Yes. But he did a thing on folklore. And what he did is he looked at all these countries, throughout history, gathered their folklore. He did this big, scraping of all their things. And he found that individualistic societies tend to stress these pro-social messages. So it teaches you lessons, right? When you're a kid, you hear various tales and of all different things, and your parents tell you this, your teachers, other people, and in these individualistic societies, there's more of these lessons of you should be sharing, you should care more about other people, be generous. um, the whole golden rule, which you mentioned early on, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. It really plays a big role in individualistic societies, and it allows people to freely trade, which is great. That's really good for markets. That's what Adam Smith figured out, right? And economists like Hayek and others since then, von Mises and the like, they're like, yeah, you need that freedom, right? That individualistic freedom to exchange with one another, but you got to trust them. And so this world, building up the social institutions of trust becomes really important. And again, that's what we say gifting does a really, really good job at doing that. So even though it's statically inefficient, you might get something you don't want. The big, positive spillover, the public good of all these gifting rituals is that it shows that you live in a society where people are willing to sacrifice, and that at any given time, you come across a random stranger you're going to interact with, they're probably going to be a generous, giving person. They're probably also going to be very gracious too. So that's great for free markets.
Individualistic societies are charitable because they're not tribal. That's what markets do. They diminish tribalism.
Absolutely. And that's it's for a lot of my students. That's a really strange lesson, right? Tribes are strong bonds together and stuff like this, but it's really those weak bonds of expanding beyond your tribe and trusting strangers, people not like you, people with diverse experiences and diverse preferences that you have to accommodate and learn how to live with and trust. That's what's really cool. And the best way to do that with somebody that you've never met before is be kind to them and give them a gift, right? So you go to a different, and many of your listeners probably have experienced this. You go to a different country and somebody welcomes you into their home, and there's this gift exchange, right? And a lot of it involves food, as I mentioned before. When I lived in Chile, there's a big buffet. You're like, oh, how could we possibly eat all this stuff? I mean, they're basically wasting food in a society where food is pretty valuable to show we want an ongoing relationship with you, right? And that breaks these tribalistic bond or these tribalistic boundaries and gets us to interact with one another. And for me, that's a beautiful thing. That's really good. And that's why I like gifting so much.
Your research will feed spin-off studies. I think you should pen a paper on the trade the efficiency of giving. Because if the leisure benefits of giving are greater than the deficits, then giving is efficient.
Yeah, I'm not. Wait, could you repeat that question? I'm not sure I got you fully
Saying
there.
presents lead to a leisure effect. And if the leisure benefits of giving are greater than the deficit, then we could say that giving is efficient. It's
Yeah,
just
and I
like
think I
it's
don't
just
know if
like
I would call it
trading.
leisure so much, the leisure benefits. I think I again we like the term, trust, bit more than that. And I think there could be a study. Our study is basically a theoretical argument why gifting actually is very beneficial and why it has lasted for centuries on end. There should be an entrepreneurial scholar out there that could try to measure that additional thing. What Professor Waldfogel did in his study was just, look at the value. How much do you value the sweater? How much does it cost in the store? Subtract the difference. There's your dead weight loss. Well, that's easy. That's static. The dynamic stuff is all that other stuff. How do I trust one another, right? How much do I enjoy the presence of being somebody in somebody's presence who is generous and who's gracious? Because not only do I, when I give a smiley button away, I like to see the person smile back, right? And that kind of, oh, you appreciated what I did for you. Oh, I like that. Now the question is, in any kind of scholarship study or in any kind of social science study, how do you measure that? We have a lot of debates about how we measure social trust, and there's these indicators in the world value surveys and Eurobarometer and all these different places. I don't know if they do a really good job of that. I don't think we can capture it very well, but nonetheless, I do think it's absolutely real. Just because we can't measure something very precisely doesn't mean it exists. But some entrepreneurial scholar out there will figure out a way to pick up our paper, read it, and measure all that stuff that we're trying to do and maybe do a cross-country comparison. So I invite people to do that.
Yeah, such a study might just win the Nobel.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm getting old, so I don't think you gotta do a study and have it like sit around for like 2 or 3 decades before the Nobel Prize Committee says, "Oh yeah, that's really good." I don't have that much time left because I'm getting pretty old. But yeah, that I would think this would be great. We're recording this on Friday, October 6th, and the Nobel Prize in economics hasn't been announced yet.
No.
I am hoping, I don't think it will happen, but I'm hoping folks like Deirdre McCloskey and Joel
Yeah.
Mokyr, or maybe, John List or somebody like that, wins the prize because Deirdre talks about
Yeah,
these.
I love Deidre McCloskey. I've
Yes,
met her.
Yeah, so we should quickly. I think the announcement's supposed to come out Monday. Maybe we can give them a call and try to influence their decision at the last minute. But I mean, her argument is that there's certain types of values that are really important for markets. A lot of them correspond to what Michael Thomas and I are talking about in our study. Graciousness. She talks about various Christian virtues have been very important. Love of your neighbor, seeing others as equal to yourselves, the dignity of people. That's all wrapped up in gifting. And McCloskey says this is one of the big reasons why we saw the big, huge
Yes.
takeoff of what she calls the Great Society, right? This enormous amount of wealth that you start to see in the world, and specifically Northern Europe, around 1500, 1600 or so. Some people date it earlier, some people later, but it's those values. And gifting is one of those things that really kind of encapsulates and captures that.
I think Joel Mokyr has produced a brilliant synthesis of the causes of the Industrial Revolution, and these causes are cultural. And his arguments are not are not one dimensional. So, for example, he speaks about progress and the ideas of progress and material science and using one's intellect to achieve success both financially and scientifically. These are really important values even today. And that's a major reason for the rise of Western societies. So, as a student of the Great Divergence, I recognize that in Western society, as early as the medieval ages, people believed in commercialization. It was not good enough to have an idea. They wrote a book or build a product. They brought it to market. An idea had to be useful.
Absolutely. I mean, more and more people should understand that in economics. The economics profession in many ways has a very bad reputation of oftentimes being the dismal science, right? Because they tell you about depression and recession and that kind of stuff. But really, I mean, the work of Deirdre and Joel Mokyr and a number of other people are trying to bring the joy back into this by saying, it's about these ideas and ideas that I think we all can, rally around the dignity of other human beings, right? The willingness to be gracious toward one another, to be generous toward one another. Generosity is good for markets. Right, my students don't get, oh no, that's just the competitive thing, and only selfish people work in markets. No, the people who do the best, the societies that do the best in markets, are the ones that are generous. Building that generosity to interact with strangers is really, really important.
Yeah, so even in the United States of America, people like to criticize the billionaire class, but how many people appreciate that several non-billionaire families today are not billionaires because they have given away so much? So I don't know if you're more than likely you are the McCormick family. They have given away a lot. The Whitneys have given away a lot. If the Rockefellers weren't philanthropic, they wouldn't be as wealthy today. They would be if they weren't philanthropic, they would have been richer. They have given away a lot. A lot of these old money families have given away a lot, and it's unique to America and the UK, the original societies that have been known for associational capital.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. And I love philanthropy. And so those examples where we talk about, the Gateses and the McCormicks, all these folks that do, big scale philanthropy, that's really wonderful. But, for both Professor Thomas and I, the real thing is just the daily philanthropy that we do. It's not just the big rich people that are generous and give back, and everybody focuses that on the news, but it's the day-to-day life, the middle class that just donate some money to build a nicer ball field in the neighborhood, or spend some time reading books at the community. And even poor people, poor people tend to be very generous, and the reason they're generous is they know that in communities where their livelihood is quite dependent upon the assistance of others, they have to signal that I'm willing to help you if you're willing to help me. And so one of the interesting findings, I think this was Arthur Brooks, did a study 10, 15 years ago, about charity. one of the more interesting things is that poorer people tend to be more charitable than wealthier people based on their income. So not, not total amount of charity that they give, but the percentage of their income. And he's found this in churches with religious institutions. People give a lot, and you find poor people tend to give a little bit more of their income. And those are the communities that actually, these self-help communities are really important in kind of building the wealth of those communities, of those neighborhoods and the like. I oftentimes worry about, and Professor Thomas and I both worry about, government coming in and saying, oh, we're going to give you welfare. That's a form of charity. Well, that charity doesn't involve any sacrifice or reciprocation of the individual recipient, right? And it oftentimes displaces a lot of that kind of charitable work, which is very concerning. I would rather see communities kind of in and of themselves just rallying to help one another, self-help communities, much more than government imposed charity, which is in many ways soulless. You don't have to be gracious when you receive it. You don't have to have the reciprocity of understanding somebody gave something to me, so I need to go out and help them as well too. So it's the stuff in civil society within our culture, the gifting culture, the culture of generosity and reciprocity, which is really, really important. And this is how government can actually chip away at that very, very important cultural norm that can be very damaging, not only to civil society, but to the economy as a whole.
Yeah, brilliant, because I'm from a developing country, and I'm from Jamaica, and there was a point in Jamaica's history when Jamaicans were known for self-help and community building and volunteering. But like other places in the world, there was a move to welfare. It's not a welfare state yet. It's not rich enough to be considered a welfare state, but there was a move to welfare and politicians acting like they are godfathers. So people in Jamaica, when they hear the term MP, member of parliament, they don't think law. They think getting money directly. And this practice has been perpetuated for over 50 years. Court martial politics. So court martial politics is not unique to the West Indies, but in other places it declined. It has been perpetuated here locally in Jamaica. So whenever there's a problem, people say, where's your MP? If you call a radio announcer because they have a problem, the announcer will say, so who's your MP? And then it's really
Yeah.
tribal and corrupt. And it's also a low trust society. So it can take forever to get a simple transaction completed. When I was in Jamaica, I went online and opened an investment account in a couple seconds. That could never have been possible back home. They would have wanted a string of notes from various people. For what? I don't know.
Yeah. No, it's very important. And this all connects together too. Really, the big, if I have to leave off with and conclude with one big message, is that, individual communities, left to their own devices, find very good ways to interact with one another and to help one another out. And over time, this expands, right? This is what expands the market and makes people wealthy. It's when governments get in the way and kind of stop that self-help, the natural. I actually kind of think it's natural, the natural generosity towards strangers that we have. Government can kind of chip away from that, and that's what really can damage the wealth of nations. Allow people to be free, allow people to be generous and kind toward one another, and to reciprocate the gifts that they get by sacrificing themselves for others. That is really what is beautiful. It builds a stronger economy, materially, but I think it builds a society, a stronger society that really allows humans to flourish, and one that we
Right.
all really want to live in.
Great. So speaking to you has been great, but unfortunately, we have to wrap up and I will continue reading your pieces. Bye.
Thank you very much. It was great being here. Bye bye.